Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our session tonight on Moving Efficiently, NYMTC Curb and Parking Management Forum. My name is Jerry Bogaz. I'm an assistant manager with NYMTC. I'll be taking you through much of the PowerPoint and the exercise tonight. I'm joined by Stephanie Brooks from our Public Affairs Office. Stephanie is going to be here to help us through the various polls we're going to be giving you. I am going to turn it over to Stephanie now so she can take you through some of the ground rules and set you up with the software. So Stephanie?
Hello, everyone. Just so you know, I think you heard as we were joining, the meeting is being recorded so that we can have a record of it. It will be posted onto YouTube later on. The participants will remain muted, and we're using a platform called Poll Everywhere, which is a really interesting interactive poll software where you'll see your results in real time. I will put a link in the chat for to at some point when we get to that part of the presentation, so you can try it out. We'll have a couple of sample polls, and you can always put information into the chat if you need to have extra things to say. And that all the polls and the chat are in the back end. It's recorded, so we would get your feedback that helps inform the plan. And for those of you who are AICP, we are offering 1.5 credits for this evening. So I think most of you know WebEx, but you just check the little chat button, little bubble there, and you'll see your comments in the chat window. The meeting will just start with Jerry giving a little overview of NYMTC. For those of you who are not familiar with what we do, I'll just do a little brief overview about Poll Everywhere, and then we'll have some discussions about curb management in the NYMTC region. And there'll be questions and polls throughout the process so we can get your feedback. So I'll take it over for Jerry.
All right, thanks, Stephanie. So this is a part of a series of topical workshops we're doing to collect input into the development of the next regional transportation plan. Actually, we had a similar session this afternoon at 3 o'clock. All of our workshop sessions are held at 3 in the afternoon, and then the second one at 7 at night. NYMTC, by the way, is a metropolitan planning organization. It covers New York City, Long Island, and the Lower Hudson Valley. There are over 400 organizations in the country like NYMTC in metropolitan regions. They exist because of federal requirements that regional planning be done as a prerequisite for federal funding for transportation improvements in a region. Our mission, as you can see on this slide, we try to serve as a collaborative forum amongst our member agencies. We'll go over them in a minute. We produce sound technical analyses for our members to use in decision making and planning. We work with them to develop a shared regional vision through this regional transportation plan. And we basically undertake this planning process in order to capture the maximum amount of federal funds possible for transportation improvements in our region. Next slide, Stephanie. So what's important to understand about NYMTC is that it's a council. It is comprised of agencies in our region. And these are the agencies. In the upper left, you see the logos of 5 suburban counties that are, their county executives are members of the NYMTC Council. Westchester, Rockland, and Putnam counties to the north, Nassau and Suffolk counties to the east. To the upper right, we have the 2 New York City members, the director of the New York City Department of City Planning and the New York City Transportation Commissioner, joined by the New York State Transportation Commissioner and the Chief Executive Officer of the MTA. Those are our voting members. Underneath that set of members, we have a number of advisory members, including the North Jersey Transportation Planning Authority, our sister MPO across the river, New Jersey Transit, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, and 3 federal oversight agencies, Federal Highway Administration, Federal Transit Administration, and the US EPA. Next slide. And this is the region that's covered as our planning area. 10 counties, 5 boroughs in New York City, and 5 suburban counties, total of 10. Next slide. So the regional transportation plan itself is really a foundational component of this metropolitan planning process that, again, is required in order for us to be eligible and for federal funding for transportation improvements and ultimately to get the money in play so that we can make those improvements. Our plan is updated every 4 years by regulation. So Literally, when we end one, we take a little breather and then we start the next cycle. And right now we're sort of 2/3 of the way through the cycle that's developing the next plan, which will be adopted in September of 2025. These plans have to have a minimum 20-year planning horizon. We usually go more than that. Our next plan will have a 29-year horizon. They also are required to include both long-range and short-range strategies, actions, projects. So these plans are not just focused on the long-range horizon, but rather it's really everything between now and that long-range horizon. And all these projects and strategies must be considered for a financial plan that's developed as part of this plan and demonstrates to the federal government that we speculate that we have enough resources to actually undertake the projects that are identified in the plan, or will have enough resources. Next slide. Now, we've been working with our member agencies for the last year and a half or so in the development of this next plan, and they've identified 6 goals which form the strategic framework of the next plan, or will form that. These proposed goals, you can see the areas that they represent. Obviously, the goal statements are a little bit more complicated than this, but these are the 6 buckets that the goals fall into at this point: safety and security, infrastructure, resiliency, congestion, land use, and transportation equity. And these goals and their related objectives really form the strategic framework of the entire plan. You'll see that the topic we're covering tonight is actually connected to 2 of these goals, but we'll get to that in a minute. Now, I believe on the next slide, we're going to go back to Stephanie, who's going to talk to you about using Poll Everywhere, take you through a couple of initial exercises.
Yes. All right. So Poll Everywhere is a very easy platform to use. I say that and watch everybody have a difficulty, but it should be an easy thing to enter from the chat. I just put it in. If you click it and WebEx tells you, are you sure you want to leave? You can say yes. It will open your browser. You can use your phone. You can use any sort of web modality that you're using, whether it's Chrome, Firefox, Edge, Safari, anything works. And what we're going to do, you'll open up the presentation and you'll type in your name, or you could stay anonymous if you prefer, and you'll just respond to questions and prompts. So starting out, we'll have a map going where you're participating from, and that should see it on your screen coming up. It's giving me a little trouble. Let me make sure the presentation is being shared properly. Come on. Oh my goodness. It does this sometimes. I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment and reshare so that we can get this working properly. Okay. Let's start the presentation again. And we'll go down to the poll. Try this again. There we go. Someone is from outside the region. 2 people are in Rockland County. So it's definitely working on the web NYMTC end of our poll, and it's showing up on the screen. So we just put just a dot or your mouse or wherever you are using, your hand, use your finger, just to show where you're coming from. We've got a little bit of Brooklyn, we have outside the region, we have Rockland County. Give it another 30 seconds because we have a lot of polls to get feedback for you. So we don't want to spend too much time on this one, but it sort of gives you a sense of where people are coming from. And the Bronx, I live there too. All right, we'll give it another 10 seconds. So it's always nice to see where people are coming from in the region. Usually we get really, really great coverage throughout the area. Are you representing an organization today? Whether it's a private citizen, professional association, government or transportation agency, consultant. You can always, if you'd like to add more, you can enter it into the chat. So we have mostly federal, state, and local government and consultant team. All right, and what type of community do you reside in? Urban, suburban, exurban, or rural? We do have rural communities in Eastern Long Island and up in Putnam, so we like to make sure we're reaching as many types of communities as possible. Looks like it's mostly urban tonight, few suburban. And then top of mind concerns. What are your top of mind concerns in terms of the subject of this session? Thoughts you might have about curb management, parking. You know, we've received a lot of great feedback at our session earlier this afternoon, so just let us know what you're thinking about. More knowledge. Thank you. Parking for micromobility. Excellent. Thanks. Pricing. Okay. Okay, it's looking like the software is working for everyone. This is great because we'll be asking some more targeted questions, and some of these ideas that you're suggesting here and thoughts we will be covering. Facility, short-term goods drop-off, food delivery, EV charging installations. Okay. Thank you very much. And if your results don't show up right away, don't worry. All of this information gets stored on the back end, so we get your feedback and we keep it. So it helps inform the plan. And now I'll turn it back over to Jerry. We're going to go a little bit more over curb and parking management in the NYMTC region.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stephanie. We're going to dig into some of these topics now and ask you more specific information. So, as I said at the outset, these two topics, curb and parking management, which obviously are related, but they are two distinct topics, they relate to proposed infrastructure and congestion goals in our new plan, specifically to the objectives of those goals. So they are squarely items we're exploring in order to develop that portion of the plan. And then they have a key aspect in transportation's role supporting economic vitality and quality of life. How we do curb and parking management contributes to safer streets. It reduces conflicts between not only vehicles and pedestrians, but also increasingly conveyances, some electric, some not, bicycles, scooters, e-bikes, and so forth. Someone mentioned already micromobility, which is certainly part of the mix when it comes to curb and parking management right now. Hopefully, this is going to ensure more appropriate use of the curb or more efficient use of the curb, and it could support demand-based parking pricing also. So there's a number of elements related to curb and parking management. Next slide. So, although you often don't think of it this way, curb space is actually a very valuable asset, particularly in either suburban downtown centers or center cities in New York City itself and so forth. Curb space is important to transportation. It's important to quality of life. It affects public health in terms of traffic congestion, safety and economic vitality. Clearly, access to commercial activity is in large part in certain areas determined by how the curb is managed. So it's kind of a stealth issue in the sense that it affects so much in the transportation realm, and yet it's not something people even associate necessarily with the transportation system. Next slide. So we've seen a boom in e-commerce and food delivery, which has put even more pressure on management of curb space and also parking management. And as someone mentioned in the top of mind issues, the use of the curb for charging electric vehicles is certainly something that's an emerging issue. Also, there's increases in for-hire vehicles and bike usage that we've seen, and that's, I would expand that out to include e-bikes, scooters, and other types of conveyances like that. Curb management is often very important to stormwater management. And now we've also, since the pandemic, had and still have the idea of outdoor dining at the curb, which further complicates the management of the space at the curb. Particularly in New York City, but also in some of the suburban communities, there's the issue of waste management at the curb and how to do that more effectively and more cleanly. And so that's an issue. So the curb is in great demand for a number of different uses. Next slide. Now, there are a number of objectives underneath each of the moving forwards vision goals that relate back to curb management, as you can see here. It's definitely something that is prevalent throughout although it's directly connected to two of the goals, it's prevalent throughout the planning process. And in fact, throughout the execution of transportation in our region, that curb and parking management are key to all those things. So this slide just underscores that. And it's really one of the reasons we're holding this workshop on this particular topic. Next slide. It's also very relevant to planned investments, where you have managing curb space can help serve varied user needs through improving mobility, access, and the flow of people, goods, and services while moving the region closer to achieving sustainability goals. So that affects both the regional transportation plan in terms of long and short range strategies and actions, and also it affects the regional transportation planning in terms of the projects and strategies that are considered in the financial plan for the future. So it has a lot of relevance to both existing transportation and planned investments in the future. Next slide. So what is it? What are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the regulation of the roadway space adjacent to the curb/sidewalk in the cases where there are sidewalks. It's controlling who can use this space and when. It's balancing the needs of all the modes: drivers, cyclists, pedestrians, delivery and goods movement, transit, and as we said earlier, waste management, and also increasingly micromobility in the form of other conveyances. It's related to programmatic planning in terms of signage, curb painting, permits, payment systems, data tracking systems. It's a very dynamic part of the transportation system, again, which is somewhat ironic because most people wouldn't think of it when they think of transportation. Next slide. So now we're going to go into some poll issues, and the first one is going to be, do you encounter issues related to curb management and access? So when we're asking you this in your everyday experience, what kind of issues do you encounter that are related to this very dynamic area of curb and parking management? Okay, so bike lane obstructions, which is an increasing issue now that there are more and more bike lanes being established. Double parking in bus lanes, again, increasing issue because premium lanes for buses and public transit are increasingly available and being established. Any other thoughts that anyone has? Think of it in terms of your own experience. Okay, Stephanie, we'll give it another like 15 seconds or so.
Got it.
All right, let's move on. And just for change of voice, Stephanie. Oh, wait a minute. I'm sorry. I didn't know there wasn't another poll. Sorry about that. So there's a spectrum of curb data management, as you can imagine. And it's an interesting way to think about it because these are all connected in one way or another. And depending on what you're doing and how intensely you're managing the curb space, you can start from the left and go all the way through to the right. You can see it starts with basic parking regulations and paid parking programs through commercial vehicles, through street signs inventory, through events, data collection, interactive data platforms, dynamically modifying supply according to demand, and that would include price, and then serving data to third-party applications for driver information and efficient enforcement. So, as you move from the left to the right, you also get more sophisticated in your approach to how to manage the curb. So these aren't necessarily sequential, even though I'm speaking of it from left to right, but they do establish critical foundations to support the next block success. So where do you find your city or agency along the spectrum is an important thing to think about. So let's go to the next slide. Here's an example from Seattle, where this features a complete inventory of street signs, locations, type, text on each sign, and so forth. a complete inventory of curb spaces and regulations, an interactive public platform to explore, and digital permit pilot for commercial vehicles and loading zones. So Seattle is increasingly moving into the digital realm, and their management of their curb space is becoming more and more sophisticated, and that's how they're responding to the demands that are placed at the curb. Next slide. In Los Angeles, they don't inventory curb spaces and regulations. They do have a public work orders database, which has irregular information where curbs are repainted and signs installed. Parking meter locations and parking citations database. There's a rough inventory of that. They're setting up data collection and inventory programs. And equity and enforcement, improving safety in motor conflicts is a growing set of issues, and they're attempting to address that. So you can see there's a contrast here between where LA is along the spectrum on top versus where Seattle is. And I believe we have two more examples. Next slide. New York is a little bit in the LA camp here in terms of they're developing a street signs locator tool, a comprehensive interactive public zone numbers, integrated street view, and summary charts. So New York is beginning to develop in a certain direction. The demands on New York's curb space, though, are increasing, I would say, exponentially. In Washington, D.C., they have a SignWorks tool focused on making work order requests fulfilled more promptly, and difficult to use for other purposes, does not have a comprehensive inventory. So you can see here that different cities have different levels of management of the curb space. And that includes everything from, the public infrastructure, the public signage, which is very, very important to managing the curb space, to usage and to different usages at different times. None of the cities, all of the cities involved have parking pricing, and they're evolving that in terms of varying that pricing by time of day. These are potentials that are growing in cities like this. Next slide. So, Stephanie, why don't we get a change of voice in here?
Sure. You got it. So this is a question about the programs your community uses. If you're aware of them, there's always a not sure, don't know at the bottom, or other. If you can respond in the chat, select as all as that apply, because some communities have more than one. Actual curb program. We're seeing here paid parking, loading zones, handicap zones, short-term pickup drop-off zones, residential permit parking program. Many places have these. Street Cafes Parklets program, like the Parklets, little tiny pocket parks, similar to the street cafes, using space, no overnight street parking, a lot of that in New York City. But it seems like mostly residential permit parking program is the dominant factor, as well as short-term pickup and drop-off zones. It's very interesting. Thank you for this feedback. I believe we have a couple more poll questions, and then we go back to the presentation. So this is another open-ended question about your current concerns, priorities for managing the curb in your community. You've mentioned some things in your top of mind, but if you want to add a few more details to what are your concerns about curb management in your community? Someone mentioned micromobility earlier. There was concerns about bicycle lane access. Just let us know. And because this information is really important, it helps inform Plan 2055, Long Range Transportation Plan for the entire region.
Sorry, Stephanie, I just want to jump in and say, priorities is also part of this. So it doesn't have to necessarily be a concern that you have, but knowing how your community is and how it operates, particularly in a dense area, like in a central business district or so forth, what priorities would you suggest for your area also?
Thank you, Jared. Yeah, that's great. So more space for parking. We're already seeing parking being sacrificed. It's according to this person's input, whether or not parking should be priced, public transit priority. Great, thank you.
A quick follow-up for the person who indicated more space for parking. You might put an answer in the chat pod, but are you suggesting parking that is not at the curb? In other words, parking areas as opposed to somehow increasing parking at the curb. Just add something to the chat on that. That would be very helpful.
Just let us know what you mean more about more space for parking. I'm going to go on to the next slide. And again, these will be captured in the back end. Oh, we got one more, creating space for outdoor dining. Yeah, it was kind of sad when a lot of those went away. We still got a few, but yeah, it's really, especially now the weather's warmer, it's such a nice thing to be able to do. And here's another open-ended question. Your thoughts on changing curb management in your community, in or the region, if you have some regional ideas as well, not just your immediate community. So suggestions, like as Jerry mentioned, or priorities that could definitely go here. Give it increased pedestrian streets. Great, thank you. Give it another 10 seconds or so. Again, you can always put things into the chat if you have additional feedback, or if you want to explain a little more about your response. Enhance non-motorized networks, more organized signs on the asphalt. Okay, great. Thank you for this specific feedback. This is very helpful. And move on to the next question. Again, this is definitely a priority question. What are the most important uses of curb management in your community?
Yeah, and I just want to jump in there, Stephanie. Use cases and uses are the same things here. We're talking about what do you see as the most important ways to use that limited curb space. And we're not just talking about in big cities or central cities. We're talking about potentially in suburban centers also.
Mm-hmm. Yes, the NYMTC region is very diverse, so we want lots of feedback, not just urban, but suburban and even exurban or rural if you have that. Freight loading and unloading. Could apply to many areas. Grocery and food delivery becoming much more popular, allowing pedestrian, oh, cool image there, pedestrian to cross the street.
I didn't know we could do that.
I know, me either. It's pretty cool. Wonder where they found that image. That's great. Does WebEx offer that? That's very cool. Well, everywhere would allow an image. That's I learned something new today. Drainage and pervious surfaces. Great. Yeah, green infrastructure. That's a critical element. Bicycle and micromobility parking. Excellent. Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to the next question. We'll put a little bit more on the presentation, then we'll move on to some more polls.
All right, so this section is on trends that we see, which are very important to both curb and parking management. Obvious in the case studies that we shared with you, movement towards more use of technology, particularly digital technology and online technology. More data collection is happening in many areas, and data-driven planning with regard to these two areas, curb and parking management. Targeting of specific use cases such as commercial vehicles, we heard about those, ride sharing and food delivery, parcel delivery or delivery in general, and of course street cafes, and standardization of data specifications, both inventory of curb assets as well as parking behavior. So combining these different data flows in meaningful ways. And of course, increasingly you have the availability of parking management and availability apps so that you can use digital technology to show people where best to find parking or to use the curb in different ways. Next slide. And here are some use cases with data-driven curb management, right-sizing the supply of loading zones according to demand. This is critical in a downtown area like Lower Manhattan or Midtown Manhattan, but also in other areas around the region. Reducing modal conflicts, and I think we've heard several times people offering micromobility as an example, both in terms of parking and just in terms of conflicts between uses. Right pricing of paid parking, so the drivers don't circulate in search of parking and cause unnecessary congestion, which also causes unnecessary emissions. Providing information to delivery drivers of loading zone locations, so they don't search around and use their vehicles more than they have to. Providing information to general drivers of pricing levels by street and understanding the impacts of land use type, densities on demand, and proactive planning around new developments. So that's important also because in many cases, development puts demands on the curbs that can't be met, and how to plan that in terms of off-street parking and so forth, as well as other types of management and regulation is a very important part of the equation of new development. Next slide.
And here is just a selection, a choice question. What role does data and technology have in curb management in your community? Well, we're seeing feedback already. Some, none, don't know, not sure. Yep, it's about equally split between all three options. And we had interesting feedback on our afternoon session as well. It was some was a definite primary feedback.
Yeah, but I think one of the reasons for that, Leslie, right, Stephanie, whatever your name is, I think that we've been trying to draw some local municipal officials, particularly from suburban areas, into these discussions, and therefore they would have more of a sense of the role of data and technology. However, so that's why the don't know, not sure is important for people who just simply don't know what their communities are doing.
And then more towards your own personal opinion, what roles do you think data technology should have in curb management in your community? So should it have more? Should it have less? We'd love to hear what you think. Significant? Okay. Give it another 10 seconds or so. And some. Okay. All right, so we've fairly evenly split between some and significant, but we're definitely not seeing none and we're not seeing minimal. So this is interesting feedback. Okay. Going to the more presentations information from Jerry.
Okay, so hearing an echo. Fidel, do you know? Okay, we're good. Thanks. So, Open Mobility Foundation data specification shows three related components here of curbs, events, and metrics. And I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail. Just wanted to point out that the area of data collection at the curb and for parking is evolving in numerous different directions that really combines behavior with management, which obviously makes sense. Next slide. So in what circumstances would having better data on these topics help your community? Somewhat duplicative of what we had before, but can you see particularly in your community where having better data on the topics we've just gone through help in terms of curb and parking management? Any thoughts on that? So it's really a question of data that's not currently collected, but having better data would certainly help. And a good example could be something like, well, if we had better data on when, you know, at-home deliveries are being made in certain neighborhoods, that would be helpful in terms of managing curb space. All right, so you have parking studies. Yep, that's true. And curb dwell times, very, very important, and a very difficult piece of information to gather. About 20 years ago, we did a study of dwell time around the Canal Street corridor in Lower Manhattan, and took an army of people most of a day to collect a whole lot of data on how long people dwelled at the curb, and what that meant for parking regulations in a very dense area of Lower Manhattan. Would imagine now those types of data can be collected in an easier fashion than we did 20 years ago. Okay. There are also new technologies emerging. So you have, of course, an integration of meters, kiosks, and phone apps. Meters being parking meters. You have inventory tools using AI for image processing. So you may be able to use those types of technologies to do things like look at dwell time and so forth. Sensors, cameras, LiDAR, RFID to track parking events, vehicle types, dwell times, etc. That's very important. Third-party data sources, commercial fleets, gig platform drivers, connected vehicles, driver safety apps, and data platforms to compile all this data and provide planning tools. The importance here also is that when you did something like look at a parking inventory, you can only do a snapshot in time, whereas some of these technologies are allowing this to be much more ongoing type of data collection, which obviously is more representative of what's actually happening in the world. So these new technologies are really helping to not only evolve planning for the curb and for parking, but also have new data emerge for those things. Next slide. Stephanie, why don't you do this one?
Sure. All right. So continuing with the technology theme, we've got a question about technologies are being used for curb management in your community that you know of. Okay, video, sensor detection of parking behavior, curbside electric vehicle chargers, pay by phone apps. Yep. Lots of those. They seem to be everywhere now. Parking meters, parking kiosks. Great. So we've got pay by phone apps, since it seems to be also, okay, vehicle chargers, electric vehicle chargers. Great. These are the two dominant ones. And we have parking meters and parking kiosks. Close second, and then video or sensor detection of parking behavior at the coming in behind like a horse race. Oops. And we'll go to the next question. Oh, well, we have modal conflicts, then the next question. Go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah, this is definitely an emerging area. We've already heard about this tonight from our participants. But you have issues of streets that were not designed to carry or can accommodate the numbers of uses that are now out there. And those conflicts, you know, what we see as important is ensuring the free flow of bicycles, transit, and cars, the free, safe flow of those things, reducing bottlenecks, which these various modes and conveyances impede each other. And despite good design, even when you have good design, these are not, these are rational beings. There's human behavior that still creates conflicts. So understanding where demand outstrips supply and causes illegal parking behavior, like double parking, parking in bike lane, and so forth, when loading zones are supplied in right amount in right places, and when general parking is priced dynamically to ensure one open space per block. So these modal conflicts are increasingly where all the action is when it comes to curb and parking management, particularly in centers, either suburban or central city. Next slide. So how much of a problem are conflicts between modes in your community? This is important to get a sense of from the people who are participating. And then I'll turn it back to Stephanie.
So we have a major problem, modal conflicts. So far, that is and little to none. Wow. So we have two completely different experiences of modal conflict. That just shows the diversity of this region. Very interesting. So we're split between little to none and major problems. Wow. It's fascinating. All right. So next question. How would you rate curbside management in your community overall? You know, considering all the different pieces that we've been talking about and that you've mentioned. And good. Again, we have lots, big distinction. This is really interesting. So it's mostly responding. Okay.
I think, Stephanie, that's borne out in our region too, where some communities have done this very actively and are doing a good job at it, and others less so. So.
It's very interesting. Yeah, sure does. I believe we have another question. What uses of the curb should be prioritized more than they are now, more than the present? And you can answer as many of these as you want. And if you have other ideas, please let us know in the chat. Commercial vehicle loading zones is important, handicap zones, bike shares and mobility stations, bus stops, parking, general paid parking. So we have handicapped access and bike share mobility options are the dominant ones for terms of choices this evening.
So again, these are prioritized more than at present.
Right.
Interesting.
More than what we see.
Parcel delivery didn't receive a vote. That's interesting.
Yeah, not at all. But bike share and shared mobility is really, and handicap share,
very
really significant. It's very interesting. Nothing in the chat yet, so we keep monitoring it. Okay.
All right.
Next. All right. And here we go to parking enforcement.
So enforcement is a huge issue, obviously, for curb and parking management. It always has been. So, you know, the way it's done with staff issuing citations, cost staff time and budget, and the budgets have been shrinking for this over time. But there are still problems of people not following parking regulations, obviously. And the question of lost revenue generation from the curb assets. So, you know, citations are a source of revenue for local municipalities, particularly small ones, but large ones too. So where's the potential for technology to make enforcement more efficient? And then there are questions, obviously, in terms of equity in enforcement to make sure that it's done fairly, no matter where you are in a particular municipality or city. Next slide. So looking just at parking enforcement in your community, how would you say it is happening right now? Is it too lax, just right, or too strict?
Seems we have real consensus on this one.
Yeah, right. Not surprisingly, we have too lax.
Go to the next question, Jerry.
Sure, let's do it. So this is an interesting question about, you know, that curb should be managed to maximize revenue generation for cities. Is that the objective? It's a question we're just throwing out there, and we're getting a really good response. Okay. Let's keep going, Stephanie. So now there's off-street parking management also, and I've alluded to that earlier in the session. And so you have off-street parking lots mainly, and you're talking about whether they be public or private, paid or unpaid, garage or surface lot. Garages themselves have lots of implications for communities in terms of structures, whether they should be near transit or in business district or shopping center. Utilization varies, significant land use impacts, and some have add-on overtime. So these are some of the issues with off-street parking lots, but also how they fit into the fabric of a commercial center or downtown, and whether or not they make ease of access to various land uses. How they fit into that is important in considering parking management that's off-street. Next slide. And you can see in this slide how a lot of that plays out in terms of the different, there's a spectrum here too, in terms of auto-centric parking management off-street versus managed parking versus multimodal and market-based parking. And it would seem that we're moving to some extent from left to right, but not consistently necessarily. And you can see some of the specifications underneath the pictures of what each of these categories means. Next slide. So if there are off-street lots in your community, what challenges have you faced in terms of your experiences in parking in those off-street lots? And if there are none or you haven't used any, please just indicate that. Time of day availability, okay. And this could include, by the way, parking at transit stations, which is a form of off-street parking. That's good. Okay. Yeah. Not always clear who is allowed to park where. Very good. There are restrictions, particularly in private lots. Anything else? Okay, Stephanie, you want to move on? So in terms of parking lots, and again, this can include parking lots at transit stations. Are they generally occupied or vacant? And does that vary by location? So this is again open-ended, but usage is important. We've already heard from someone that its usage time of day can be a challenge. So generally, are the lots occupied or vacant? What's your perception? And it does vary by location, is what we're getting here. Varies heavily by location. That's very interesting.
Could you put more just information on that in the chat? It'd be interesting to mean what is heavily, how is that defined? Like, is it depend on how dense an area is? Does it depend on time of day? Well, that's not really location, but we'd love to know more about that.
Okay, Stephanie, why don't we move on at this point? We do have something in the chat from Chris. Depends on density of employment and activities. Thank you, Chris. Okay. So next question is related. Do you think that land could be used for something else? Any specific use or activity that you'd like to see with that space? So this is land that's specifically now dedicated to off-street parking, and are there other uses for it that would make sense if it were not needed for off-street parking? Housing, okay, parking in parks, parking into parks, I should say. High density housing, very good. Business development. All right. It's always interesting to me, Stephanie, how these responses vary given the time of the workshop, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
this is very different from what we received this afternoon.
But then this afternoon, we probably had people who were more either advocates or professional planners and so forth. local municipal planners, whereas in the evening, we tend to have more people who do other things during the day and are just interested in the topic. So,
It's great to have both opinions.
yeah, well, that's why we do it this way. And now, key question for the future: do you want to see EV charging as an option at your local parking lots? Let's focus on parking lots here as opposed to curbside at this point. So far, a big yes. Okay, well, that seems emphatic, Stephanie. So let's keep going.
We have some definite input here.
All right. So at this point, you've given us a lot of information, and we certainly appreciate your time this evening. There is a couple minutes here where we can take some questions if you raise an electronic hand, and we can unmute you, and you can ask a question verbally. If not, that's fine also. But let's just see if there's anyone who has a question that you want to ask.
In the meantime, I put in the chat a link to the Plan 2055 Moving Forward 2055 website, moving forward 2055.org. Lots of opportunities to continue to stay involved, to review and view previous feedback, and we have one more topical forum coming up as well in 2 weeks.
Right. In 2 weeks, we have our last topical forum. We're in the end game of our public outreach for this plan. We did a lot of work in the fall with an online interactive survey and with pop-up sessions throughout the region that we did. These topical workshops are what we've done so far in the spring. We've collected a tremendous amount of information from both of these, or all of these efforts, I should say. And it's been very varied, and we're always struck by how cognizant people are, regardless of whether they're private citizens or working for a municipality or a professional planner or what have you, about these issues. It's always very interesting and very heartening to see how these are issues that affect people's lives, and that you give us great feedback in terms of what you see as being important and what you see is emerging in the future, which is very important to our ability to really make a responsive plan. So we certainly appreciate. I don't see anyone who's going to take us up.
There is a chat question. We don't have any hands raised, but the chat question is, does it cost a lot for a municipality to build a curb database from scratch? Is there a tangible return on investment to sell the idea to them? That's a good question.
That's a great question. I'm not sure I have the technical knowledge to answer it, but my guess would be just, in my experience in terms of building databases and using databases, is that software packages are not that expensive. It depends on what kind of hardware that you really need to go with that. And there could be a tangible return on investment if congestion is reduced by doing this and safety is increased. So I don't think it's a huge lift, but there may be local municipal officials in our region who would dispute me on that. So it's certainly not, it's something where larger cities like New York City are definitely getting into it in a real way because of the real problems that they're facing. And of course, they have many more resources that can be used. Suburban communities of different sizes are more hard pressed on the resource side. That's a good question, though. All right, if there's nothing else, again, we very much appreciate your time tonight. Thank you for providing this information. We make a pledge that everything that we hear is going to be at least considered. It may not all end up in the plan, but at least be considered, and it will definitely help us to shape our upcoming plan. And now Stephanie is going to finish up by talking about the AICP credits, if any of you are interested in that.
Yes, so if you are a planner and you'd like to receive some AICP credits for this, we're offering 1.5 credits. You don't need to read the screen because I just put the link in the chat, and it actually goes directly to the planning page on the APA website. You can go onto that page and log your time here. So if you have trouble accessing that, that for whatever reason, if you have trouble accessing this this page, just go into planning.org and just type in NYMTC, and you will find as the keyword, and you will find this this June 11th event. So they usually do not ask to, usually the APA does not ask to put in a log. of, or I'm sorry, a form, an evaluation form. But if for any reason they do, I'm going to put my email in the address in the chat, and you can always email me if the APA does ask you for, oops, I should have the con, right? For a log. Usually they do not ask for any sort of evaluation form, but just in case they do. Okay.
All right, great.
Yep.
And again, thanks everyone. Thanks for our support staff, our IT support and so forth for the work you did with us tonight. And Stephanie, if you have a minute, could you give me a call after we're done? Okay, thanks folks. Have a good evening.